The auctioneer paused. He leaned forward over the stand. He looked at the small voice that had just spoken from the back of the lot, and then he made the mistake of smiling. "Honey," he said, gentle, the way a man speaks to a child who has wandered up to a counter in a hardware store. "This isn't something for you. You want to step back, sweetheart. Let the men work." She did not step back. She did not lower her hand. She was about 13, in jeans and a faded green t-shirt and a pair of sneakers that were a size too big for her. And she had her hand in the air at the level of her ear, the way a child raises her hand in a classroom. And she had said the number clearly enough that the men at the front of the crowd had heard it and turned around. She said it again. 12,000. Hollis at the stand, who was not actually named Hollis, but might as well have been, the way he ran a country sale, looked at her and looked at the bank's representative in the front row and looked back at her. And a few men along the rail laughed, not loud, just enough to make the point that a child had wandered into something that did not belong to her. That was when the side door of the equipment shed opened, and Sheriff Marvin Tatum of Caldwell County, Missouri, walked in with an envelope in his hand and stopped the auction. That is where this story ends up. Now I'll back up and tell you how it got there. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. It was the second Saturday of August, 2018. Caldwell County sits in the northwest quarter of Missouri, in the rolling country between the Grand River and the Shoal Creek bottoms, where the corn comes in tall and the towns are small, and most everybody knows most everybody else by their grandfather's first name. The auction was being held at a place called Pleasant Ridge, on a 160-acre farm that had belonged for 41 years to a man named Robert Eugene Marsh, who had passed in March of that same year of pancreatic cancer at the age of 52. Robert Marsh had left behind one daughter, Hannah, who was 13 years old at the time of the sale, and no other family closer than a cousin in Oklahoma who had not been to Missouri in 15 years. Hannah had been living since March with a neighbor woman named Loretta Boggs, who had a small place on the next section road and who had taken her in the day after the funeral without asking anybody's permission. Loretta was 61. She had buried 2 husbands. She had no children of her own. She had watched Hannah grow up across the fence line, and she had told the social worker out of Kingston that the girl was staying with her until somebody official told her otherwise. And the social worker, who was overworked and underpaid, had written it down and not bothered Loretta about it again. The farm was selling that Saturday because the bank that held a mortgage on the front 120 acres had moved to foreclose 2 months after Robert's death, and the executor, a lawyer out of Hamilton named Phil Krause, had decided to liquidate the entire estate at the same sale to settle the remaining debts. The front 120 was going to the bank's preferred buyer. That was already understood. The equipment, the truck, the household, those were being sold off in lots. And the back 40, which was the southern 40 acres of the farm, the piece nobody walked anymore because it sat low and timbered along Shoal Creek, was being sold separately as a parcel of timber and pasture ground. The crowd that morning was a usual sale crowd, about 120 people. Buyers from the implement dealer in Cameron, 2 timbermen from out by Polo, a handful of neighboring farmers looking at the equipment. Phil Krause, the executor, in a brown suit, in the front row. The bank's man, in a different brown suit, next to him. Loretta Boggs, in a denim jacket, at the back, with one hand on Hannah's shoulder. And Hannah herself, who had not said anything to anybody all morning, watching the sale with a kind of focused stillness a child has when a child is keeping a secret she has been told to keep. She had been told to keep it by her father. 3 weeks before he died, Robert Marsh had taken his daughter out to the back 40 in the F-250 and parked at the edge of the timber and walked her down to a creek bend where a sycamore came out over the water at an angle. He had sat with her on a fallen log. He had told her in the careful voice of a man who knew he was running out of time and was trying not to scare a 13-year-old, that this piece of ground was hers, that he had filed the paperwork at the courthouse in February, that the bank had no claim on it because he had owned it free and clear, separately, since 1998, when he had bought it back from his uncle. That he had recorded a warranty deed in February of 2018, transferring the back 40 to her, with a small trust to manage it until she turned 18, and that the trustee was a man named Marvin Tatum, who had been her father's friend since they were both 8 years old, and who happened to be the elected sheriff of Caldwell County. He had told her where the original deed was kept. He had told her that if anything happened, anything at all, she was to go to Marvin and tell him the words, "Robert said it was time." Marvin would do the rest. Robert Marsh had died 11 days after that conversation. The funeral had been in March. The world had moved fast. The bank had moved fast. Phil Krause had moved fast. The estate on paper had appeared to include the entire farm because the records had not yet been pulled forward at the county clerk's office, the way records sometimes lag in small counties when filings are recent and the clerk is short-staffed, and one of the staff members has retired in February. Phil Krause, who was not a dishonest man but was a busy one, had pulled a title search in early April that did not yet reflect the February filing, because the February filing had been processed but not yet indexed in the system Phil's office used. He had proceeded on what he had. He had scheduled the sale. Hannah had told Loretta about the conversation with her father a week after the funeral. Loretta had believed her. Loretta had also been raised in a generation that did not entirely trust lawyers and banks to do right by a 13-year-old orphan. And Loretta had decided, quietly, that they were going to make sure. She had driven Hannah to the sheriff's office in Kingston in May. She had sat in the waiting room while Hannah had gone in alone and said the words to Marvin Tatum across his desk. Robert said it was time. Marvin had looked at Hannah for a long minute. He had not said anything. He had gotten up from his desk and walked to a small, fireproof cabinet in the corner of his office that had been there since he took the job in 2010. And he had unlocked it with a key from his own key ring, and he had taken out a manila envelope sealed with packing tape, with Hannah's name written on it in Robert Marsh's handwriting, and the date February 14th, 2018, and the words, "Do not open until she asks." He had opened it in front of her. Inside was a recorded warranty deed, stamped by the Caldwell County Recorder of Deeds on February 14th, 2018, transferring the southern 40 acres of the Marsh farm, legally described, to Hannah Elizabeth Marsh, with Marvin Tatum as trustee until her 18th birthday. There was also a letter from her father. Marvin had read the deed twice. He had then sat down across from Hannah and asked her, careful, what she wanted to do. Hannah had said she wanted her land. Marvin had said all right. He had told her not to say anything to anyone, not to Phil Krause, not to the bank, not to anyone at school. He had told her there was going to be a sale, probably in the summer, and that he would handle it. He had told her she would need to be there. He had told her that if anyone asked her to bid on the back 40 before he got there, she should bid, even if she did not have the money, because the bidding itself would establish on the record that she had asserted a claim, and that he would arrive before any sale was completed, and that everything would be all right. That is why on the second Saturday of August 2018, a 13-year-old girl in a too big pair of sneakers raised her hand at a Caldwell County estate auction and said the words, $12,000, in a clear voice that carried farther than she meant it to. The auction had moved through the equipment lots all morning. The truck had gone for $9,000. The combine, which was old, had gone for $14,000. The bidding had been steady and unsurprising. At about 1:15 in the afternoon, the auctioneer announced Lot 31, the southern 40 acres, sold separately as timber and pasture, and Phil Krause stood up from the front row and read a short legal description, and the bidding opened at $10,000. The timberman from Polo went 11. A man from Cameron went 11.5. A second timberman went 12. The auctioneer called for 12.5. There was a pause. Hannah raised her hand. She said 12,000. That bid was not technically valid because the standing bid was already 12. But the auctioneer at the stand was a man who had been calling sales in Caldwell and Clinton counties for 26 years, and he understood, the moment he heard a child's voice at the back of his crowd, that something unusual was happening, and he paused, and he leaned forward, and he tried to be kind about it, and he made the mistake of smiling. That was the moment we opened on. That was the moment the side door opened. Marvin Tatum was 52 years old. He was wearing his uniform. He had the envelope in his left hand and his hat in his right. He walked up the center aisle of the equipment shed without hurrying, and the crowd, which had been laughing 30 seconds earlier, was not laughing now, because a sheriff walking up the aisle of an estate sale with a sealed envelope and his hat in his hand is not a thing a person sees often. And the men in the room understood, even before he said anything, that they had walked into something they had not understood the shape of when they walked in. Marvin reached the stand. He shook the auctioneer's hand. He turned to face the crowd. He said, in the voice of a man who had practiced what he was going to say in his truck on the way over, that he was sorry to interrupt, but that the southern 40 acres of this property was not part of the estate being sold, and could not be sold, and any bids on it were void. He said this calmly. He said he had documentation. He held up the envelope. He walked over to Phil Krause, who had gone the color of a man who has just understood something he should have caught 4 months earlier. And he handed Phil the envelope, and Phil opened it, and Phil read it, and Phil sat down without saying anything. Marvin then walked to the back of the room and stopped in front of Hannah. He did not bend down. He spoke to her at her own height. He said, "You did good, honey. You can put your hand down now." Hannah put her hand down. The auction did not resume that afternoon. Phil Krause called for a recess, conferred with the bank's representative, conferred by phone with his office, and announced after 20 minutes that Lot 31 was withdrawn from sale, with apologies, and that the remainder of the sale would continue. The timberman from Polo, who had been the standing bidder at $12,000, asked Phil what had happened. Phil said the parcel was not in the estate. He said it had been deeded out before death. He said the recording had not yet been indexed when the title search was run. He said he was sorry. The timberman, who was not a bad man, said he understood. He said he was glad it had been caught before money changed hands. He looked at Hannah at the back of the room, and he tipped his cap to her, and he meant it. The rest of the farm sold. The bank got its 120. The equipment went to its various buyers. Loretta drove Hannah home that evening in her own truck, and Hannah did not say much on the drive, and Loretta did not push her. Marvin Tatum followed them in his cruiser as far as Loretta's lane, and then turned around and went back to Kingston. The back 40 stayed in Hannah's name. Marvin held it in trust until her 18th birthday in 2023. He never charged a fee for it. He filed the annual paperwork himself. He walked the property with Hannah every fall, the same week of October, to mark the corners and check the fences. He told her, the first fall, that the sycamore at the creek bend was the same sycamore her father had sat under with him in 1976 when they were 10 years old and had told each other they were going to be best friends, which they had been for 40 years until Robert was buried in the spring of 2018. Marvin had cried telling her this. He had not meant to. Hannah had reached over and put her small hand on his sleeve and not said anything. Hannah is 21 now. She lives in Columbia. She is finishing a degree in agricultural law at the University of Missouri. She still owns the back 40. She has not sold a tree off it. She drives up to Caldwell County one weekend a month, and she stays with Loretta Boggs, who is 64 now and who Hannah calls Grandma, and they walk the property together. Marvin Tatum retired from the sheriff's office in 2024. He still walks the corners with Hannah every October. He says he promised her father he would, and he does not see any reason to stop just because he is retired and her father is gone and she has grown. A promise made in the kitchen of a dying man, he told her once, does not have a date on the back of it. The auctioneer who paused that day, who leaned forward, who smiled, who said, "Honey, this isn't for you," retired the next year. He told a reporter from the Hamilton paper in an interview about his career that the moment he was proudest of in 26 years of calling sales was the moment he had been most clearly wrong. Because if he had not paused, if he had not leaned forward, if he had pushed the bidding through to the next number the way another auctioneer might have, the sale would have closed before Marvin Tatum walked through the door, and a 13-year-old girl would have lost a piece of ground her father had spent his last clear weeks making sure she would have. He said he was glad he had been slow about it. He said sometimes the best work an auctioneer does is the work of not finishing the sale. There are things that look like a child's mistake at the back of a crowded room. There are men in brown suits in the front row who have already decided what is being sold. And there are sealed envelopes in fireproof cabinets in small county sheriff's offices, with names written on them in the handwriting of dying men, that wait, sometimes for months, to be opened on the right afternoon. Robert Marsh had been gone 5 months by then, but he had filed the paperwork in February. He had told his daughter the words. He had picked the right friend 42 years before he needed him. The auction stopped because a man walked to a door at the right minute, but the door had been built a long time before that, by a father who had run out of time and had used the time he had left to build it. Some things are settled in the room they happen in. The good ones are settled long before.